Ladies and gentlemen, in this video we are going to paint up the man, the myth, the monster, the man that raises share prices on tissue paper. That is Mortarion. So stick around in this video if you want to see how I painted this absolutely disgusting model. Now, with Mortarion, he is such a big beastie that I had to paint him in sub-assemblies. If you're not sure what sub-assemblies are, basically, I didn't construct the whole model and then paint it all in one go. I left parts separate so that I could paint them individually and make it a lot easier for myself. Mortarion is a monster of a model, so it does lend itself to painting in sub-assemblies. As you can see, what I've done is I've left the wings off, the main body is separate, and then all the little chains and nurglings in the base have all been left separate as well. Therefore, I can paint all of them without really obstructing myself by constructing the model too early. This gives me a lot more flexibility and allows me to do a lot more techniques in a lot of different places. Now, what we want to watch out for with Mortarion is he is a big model, so we are going to utilize some tools which lend themselves to big models, and that, first off, is the airbrush. What you can see here as well is I've primed the model black and then used a zenithal highlight so I can actually see what's going on with the model itself. Now, I'm starting off with Vallejo Model Air Dark Sea Green. Now, we're going to be plastering this all over the armor. I'm going to try and concentrate it on the armor itself. It doesn't matter too much if it overflows into the other areas. Then we're going to follow up with armor green, and we're going to pretty much do the same again. The dark sea green was our initial base coat, and the armor green is kind of our secondary base coat. What we're going to use is a slight zenithal, so we're going to use a slight angle on this, so the majority will still be armor green. However, there will be some much darker areas in the sort of cracks and crevices and so forth. That's our starting point. This is quite nice sort of plagueish green that I like. Then we're going to move on to Deathworld Forest. This is where we're going to start focusing on getting some sort of like gradient and highlight in there. So as you can see, I'm being a little bit more reserved with this. We're going to aim for more the top areas. Now we're going to use Lauren Green. And this, again, is we're going to reinforce that Deathworld Forest highlight at the same time. So I'm using a lot of layers of green. This model is so big that I thought it lend itself to a lot of different colors in it to just, you know, reinforce it. You might be able to get away with like 3 of the colors. However, I think every single layer adds to this one, which is why I went with a few different ones. Then we're going to use Nurgling Green, and again we're going to focus more towards the highlights here. We really do want to keep this a bit more reserved now. We want to keep that gradient so we can see the transition between the higher and the lower tones, creating that sense of volume on the model. This will really focus on your airbrush control and trigger control, so you don't want to be blasting this all over the model. This is just reserved for the higher up spots, and just take your time with that a little bit because this sets up the model for the rest of it. The rest of it after this work will all be brush work. So if you're going to do the airbrush work, get it right, do it right now, and then you won't have to worry because we can control the rest with our normal brushes afterwards. Then we're going to finish off with Duck Egg Green from Vallejo Model Air. And this will be our final highlight, and this again being much more reserved, much tinier highlights now, but this gives us that little pop factor which really makes the armor stand out. Now, after looking at this, I'm quite happy with this armor. We're going to be adding washes, we're going to be adding other colors here, so if it does seem bright right now, don't worry, it is going to darken down just by the nature of all the trims and all the washes that will go onto it. However, it gives us a nice punchy highlight that will work with the rest of the model throughout the entire painting process, and it will transition through to the end as well. We're then going to do a very labour intensive and frankly very boring part, and that is painting all the trim. I'm using Vallejo model colour brass here because I find this is actually the best gold out there, even though it is a brass colour. It's just solid. It's a very solid colour. I find it more solid than any other gold that I've worked with, so it's kind of my default gold is brass. And that's weird now that I say that. Then we're going to use Vallejo Metal Color Jet Exhaust, and this is going to cover all the metal areas, so we're talking all the spikes, all the chains. There's more of this than you might think. All over the model there's various different bits and bobs, and I want to say accoutrements to embellish this model. However, you're going to have to work your way around it. It's a bit of an exploration around the model to find out where things are, and this is where you realise there's a lot more detail here than you initially thought. So when you may have put it together at the beginning, you may have thought, oh, okay, yeah, there's a bit. This really goes to show that whoever designed this put a hell of a lot of work into it. Then we're going to use Metal Color White Aluminium. Yes, I know I said aluminium, not aluminum. Apologies. If you're American, that's how we say it in Britain. Now, I've chosen this one because it is an extreme highlight. Because we're going to be using washes afterwards, I thought it made more sense to jump to the highest point and let the washes do the blending afterwards. A lot of the times you can do very subtle transitions, however I wanted a bit more of a striking contrast, so I jumped straight to the last point, and I'm going to let the washes do the blending between the darkest tone and the lightest tone. Make sure as well, when you're doing metal colours, you are using a brush which you are not afraid that will get wrecked. Metal colours actually contain fragments of metal and will basically wreck any nice brush that you've got. So use a synthetic one, use one that you're not overly fussed about getting mucked up. If you can get a point on it, that's great, but just remember, with a lot of metal work, you're probably going to end up with a bit of a frayed brush afterwards. Then we're coming in with our good old favourite Agrax Earthshade, and this is just going to wash over the brass areas we did earlier. This is just to get a bit of shade on it, and also we're going to wash over the green armour panels as well. Now, with the wash of Agrax Earthshade, I went pretty thick over the brass areas. However, when I went over the green areas of the armour, I thinned it down quite a lot. I really didn't want to ruin that nice gradient that I got earlier with the airbrush, so I thinned it down a lot so that it would only settle in the recesses and in the cracks, so it just brings out the volumes and it just defines the model. Now we're going to use AK Interactive Rust Streaks. Now with this is an enamel paint, so what you do is you initially put it on and then you thin it afterwards with either white spirits or odorless thinner. Mortarion is a monster of a model. Now we want to try and cram as much detail as we can in here. This will seem very subtle in the finished product. You won't really notice it until you go up close. Now, but because this model is so large, that actually works in our favour. Just remember, when you're doing stuff with enamel washes, do wash off with either white spirit or odorless spirit and use a brush which you are again not too fussed about, because it's not going to be kind to your brushes, so just bear that in mind. Now we're going to use Xeris Purple. This is one of the GW Citadel paints, and we're going to paint this on pretty thick, and we've got to go over all of the robes. Now watch out for this, he's actually got two different coloured layer robes going on here, so use the box art as reference. There's like a top robe which is purple, and then there's an under robe which is cream. This model I thought initially wasn't very busy until I had a look at the box art, and I kept on referencing and looking back, and I realized this model is incredibly busy. It's probably a little bit more busy than I would have thought of for a plague kind of thing, but it is, and I tried to follow true to the box art because this was a commission for a client and this is what they requested. Now we're going to use Druchii Violet here to wash over all the purple and bring it down to a more darker tone so we get the recesses in. We're then going to use Xandri Dust to paint in our underrobe. I'm going to call it underrobe, but this kind of cloth which goes all the way down to the ground here. Again, put this on pretty thick, so you can do two thin coats, you can do one thick coat. Just make sure the detail doesn't get obscured too much, but you do want that on as a thick solid colour, so nice and opaque with that one. We're also going to do it all over the horn things on his back. I'm not entirely sure what these are, they're like spore things, and also all the horns that are sticking out of his armour as well. Also as well, the bone rivets on his scythe silence. And yes, hopefully that's the last of the bone colours. Now we're going to mix up some white sands from Scale Colour, and we're going to mix that in with our Xandri dust, and we're going to start doing highlights. Instead of actually opting for a colour as the highlight, I thought mixing it might be better. Your preference can obviously be different. If I was going to use a dedicated colour and not mix, I'd maybe go with something like your Shabti Bone, and then highlight up with white sand from Scale Colour. That is completely your preference though at the end of the day. I've decided to go with a mix, so I've only used 2, but you can transition as much as you want, or transition even less. On that note, whilst we're doing some blending, I do have to recommend Broken Toad brushes. They are a sponsor of the Chilling Wargamers, which I am part of, so effectively they sponsor me. If you would like some amazing brushes, please go check out Broken Toad. I exclusively use them now, and I have been using them for years, and I can't sing their praises enough. They are just really good, solid brushes. Please go check them out if you can. They're great company. Now we're coming back in with Xeris Purple again, and we're going to highlight up the purple cloth. Now this, I'm using little tiny sort of scratchy marks all over it to simulate texture of cloth. You don't have to be exact here, and they don't have to be really refined. This is just to simulate a little bit of texture in the cloth itself. On the next step, we'll go a little bit lighter, and again, we'll refine it a little bit more. Each layer is Xeris Purple mixed up with a little bit more white sands, and we're just going higher and higher with smaller and smaller scratches, so we start really getting some texture in on this cloth. One thing I didn't film was me painting his red loincloth. That is just Vallejo Game Air Gory Red, and then I'm highlighting up with Mephiston Red. I'm trying to do a similar kind of thing with a little bit of scratches, but I end up giving up and just go with kind of an edge highlight with this. There's not much more to it. It's one of the less significant parts. I mean, personally, I wouldn't have painted it red, but box art, what it wants, so red it is. Now we're using a very thinned down Agrax Earth shade all over the horns, the white cloth, the bits of metal. This is to try and shade everything, and as you can see, you can barely tell that there's actually any Agrax Earth shade on there. This is something like 10 parts water to 1 part Agrax Earth shade. I'm doing glaze after glaze after glaze here to try and get a very subtle transition between them. It's a step which I wouldn't do on an army, however on a big centerpiece model like this, I think it deserves it. Just a little bit more time to just go over and over and over again, and since you're doing so many thin glazes like this, it's actually quite hard to muck it up because the glazes are so thin, you can easily correct a step by just transitioning to another one. Now, what I'm doing is just highlighting up the gold, and we're doing this with brass mixed with white aluminium. So this gives us our kind of highlight layers, and then I'm just touching up a tiny bit with white aluminium again, so we get our highlights in the gold. They were just looking a little bit too flat, so I wanted to accentuate those little bits and give it a little bit more gradation. Now we're using Leviathan Blue, and this is a contrast paint from Citadel, and we're going to use this on the bottom of the ropes. It comes out pretty thick. This is a very opaque paint. So what I've done is I plastered it on, and then I washed off all the paint off my brush and just came back in with a wet brush and started blending it back in. I did this on all the smokestacks as well, so although I didn't need to blend it on that part. I then used Vallejo Game Color Tiny Tin to paint the lantern, which is his big ass plasma pistol. I also used this all over all of his little orbs and sensor urn thingies all over the model. Anywhere which hasn't been painted with the jet wash earlier and you want it to be that kind of brassy color, go in then. We're then going to use a Mephiston Red, and we're going to paint this weird blood vein that's in the scythe. This isn't a detail which I noticed before until I started painting, and then I realized, this thing's got blood in it. What I did with the rest of the scythe is I watered down the red and I started just glazing this over various different areas. It just gave it a tint of kind of a red tinge to the things, giving this kind of alive appearance. Then going back to lantern, I used Warpstone Glow, and then I followed this up with progressive highlights from Moot Green, and then added in a little bit of white to just bring it up over and over again. What I also did was a little bit of a glaze at the beginning with Warpstone Glow just around where the plasma coils are, just to give it that glow effect with the OS cell. It's not necessary, you could get away without it, but I think it just adds to it, adds to that kind of glowing sensation. I personally as well also think about maybe changing this to a yellow if it was going to be my own, but yeah, it's just more because it's called the Lantern, you'd think, but hey. Now what we're doing is coming in with Magic Blue, and we're just going to highlight all that blue area around the bottom of the cloth. It's a very weird transition going from white to blue at the bottom and having all the smoke as blue. Me, personally, I would have gone that way, but it was the client's colour scheme. Blue cloth, blue smoke is what it is. It's a bit of a weird one, but I worked with what I've got and I think it came out alright. What I also did as well was mixed in a little bit of green in there. Because the blue was very striking, I kind of wanted to blend it in with the rest of the model. So the green made a bit more sense to just glaze little bits of this in to just, you know, tie it all together. It just seemed a little bit too jarring just being solid blue. So little bits of green just kind of reinforced it and, yeah, as I said, brought it back together. Then anywhere I didn't feel was right, I added a little bit more blue back in just to kind of accentuate it and blend it all together. Also, there's a little weird bit of smoke between this mask respirator. Then I added a little bit of white to the red that I had earlier, and I just highlighted that weird blood vein in the side. That's creepy weird. Then I went through and I painted all the little flies in the smokestack at the back, and this is just using white aluminium again, and we're just going to paint them solid like that. We've got a trick with that in a minute. Now I have to mention as well, there's a part which I didn't film, and that was painting all the pipes. They are just basically shadow grey with highlights of white added in afterwards. I just painted them and I realised I hadn't filmed it, so if you wanted to know, that's how I did that. Now coming back to the brass and the gold again, I thought that needed a little bit more accentuating, so I came in with Agrax Earthshade Gloss. I find this is much handier to do a gloss shade over metallics because it keeps their metallic properties. If you go in with normal Agrax, it tends to dull it down a bit, and it just, yeah, not overly keen on it. Now another thing I did as well was I tried to make the eyes look bloodshot, and I mixed up a little bit of white with Amethyst Red and watered it down a bit, and tried to glaze it into the eye sockets there so it looked like he had bloodshot eyes. I think it kind of works. It's a very small detail, you could probably get away without it, but I thought this model deserved it. Now we're going to use Plague Bearer Flesh, and we're just going to paint over all those flies we did earlier. We're just going to let that settle, and once that's dried, we're going to come in with non-oil gloss and just coat all of those flies, and this gives us our greeny, metallic-y, weird, buggy coloured flies. So yeah, I thought it worked quite nicely. It's quite a simple, quick little way of doing it. Another thing I did was I came in with the brass again, and I started highlighting all the areas where I'd done in tiny tins earlier. Then I used Plague Bearer Flesh again, and this went over all of the little nurglings. All of the little nurglings basically use the same techniques that have been used on the rest of the model, however they just shrunk down to a smaller scale. The only things which you might not have seen are like tongues and stuff like that, and they are basically just red added with white to make a pink, and that's that. There's not really a lot to them. I didn't really fancy drawing too much attention to the nurglings in this video because the main part of it was on the main model. Now we're going to use Contrast Dark Oath Flesh, and this is going to paint the wings. Some people might have thought that I might have gone with the airbrush with this technique, however I thought contrast paint would lend itself to this. Since they've got very fluid properties, I thought they would flow into the cracks and the crevices a lot better, so I decided to just hit it with a big brush and just dump it all over the model. I then got some scale colour pale skin, and I started dry brushing this and stippling it all over the wings. There wasn't any real logic to this madness, it's just I wanted to add texture to it. I wanted to get it done quickly-ish because I thought if I spent too long on this it's just going to stall the entire project. So I just went in with this and it worked like a charm. Stippling dry brushing is, I know a lot of people shun it, but it really worked in this instance. It didn't seep into the lower crevices, and it gave me some texture with all the stippling effects. When I do stippling or dry brushing, I use cheap makeup brushes to do this. They're soft enough that they won't be too harsh when I dry brush and give it a nice subtle blend. Now I'm going to use Reikland Flesh Shade, and all I'm going to do is highlight, well I say highlight, I'm going to shade the underside of the wing. So as you saw, I thinned it down a fair bit there, and we're just going to do multiple passes of this until we got to the consistency we want. Just going to bring it down and down and down until the bottom of the wing is a almost red colour. Since it's so thinned down, it will blend well enough, and as you do multiple passes, much like we did with the Agrax Earthshade earlier, it will just go on easily enough. I then did the same with Athematic Blue as the contrast paint, and we just focused in on doing a light coat all over that was very thin down, then it came in with a slightly heavier coat, and just built it up till the top of the wing was this nice cold colour. It created this nice contrast between warm and cold, the bottom side being nice and warm and the top side being nice and cold. So it was a bit of a strange thought, but I think the result is quite nice. Interesting enough, it looks a little bit like the French flag. Then I tested out how the model was going to sit on the base. Since I'd done this in sub-assemblies, I had to make sure this thing would actually stand up. So I had to check the base positions and see how the model was going to sit on it, and also where it was going to sit. I didn't want to sit too far back, so had to test fit it and then test fit again once it was all glued down. I strongly advise doing this. Don't think you've got it right, make sure you've got it right. Then I assembled all the sub-assemblies to it, so this model is really coming to life now. And I wasn't entirely sure what to do with the base, but I knew I needed to give it texture, so I turned to AK Interactive's Muddy Ground, and I basically plastered this all over the base apart from where the rocks are, just making sure to get it into all the creases and crevices to make sure we get some extra texture in there. I then used the sculpting tool that was applying it all to create little kind of indentations where a pool of liquid might be, so I wanted to create little kind of puddly areas in this model. Then I came in with Leviathan Blue again, the contrast paint, and I just plastered this all over the model in squiggly patterns. This was kind of my artistic side cutting loose because I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to shade this model, and I find the easiest way of doing things is basically make a mess and then see what comes out of it and then work from there. And I know that's a very strange logic, and a lot of people might freak out with that kind of logic, but there's something to be said for randomness and chaos, which provides beauty, and I just lent into it. And I think it's turning out alright. It's this weird mix of cold and warm with a kind of semi-organic state as well. I also applied all the red, which is Mephiston red, thinned down as well, all over the base just to kind of accentuate it. I then used AK Interactive Still Water to create the puddle effects that I was after earlier. Now, I find this product does shrink a fair amount, so if you're going to do this in the future, if you wanted deeper puddles, go with something a little bit different. Then I tried something very weird by using the Citadel Tesseract Glow, and I started trying to mix it into the water, and I realized it didn't mix very well. So then I tried mixing more with using Hexwraith Flame into the Tesseract Glow. And again, didn't mix very well, but then also did mix very well. It was a very confusing thing. I'm not entirely sure why I did it, but I do like the result afterwards. It takes a little bit of finesse and a little bit of jiggery pokery, and you have to go back in with the Tesseract Glow and the Hexwraith Flame. You have to basically wet blend in water. So yeah, it does make it rather interesting. I then came back in with the Agrax Earthshade just to shade the entire model. This is thinned down a fair bit, but at the same time you do want all that shade, so don't do the glazes that we were doing earlier. Do maybe like 1 part water Agrax Earthshade just so that you've got at least some definition that's sinking into it. You just don't want this thing to just turn completely brown though. I then used some Nuln Oil to shade different areas where I wanted a little bit more contrast and a little bit more of a shadow going on. And then, the magical moment, gluing the model to the base. Be careful with this bit, it's really tricky. Don't use activator until you know everything's locked in place, and if I can stress anything, just do 1 point at a time. Do the first point, do the second point, and do the third point. Once they're all locked in, you're good to go. Let it dry, let everything set, and then you've got your model. And he's attached to a base. At this point you can pick it up by the base, but he's so massive anyway. Yeah, it's going to take a little bit of work. Then I attached the wings, And this boy is looking pretty good. Now, we're not fully done yet. We still got a few more tricks to do. You would think we're done, but there's a couple extra bits of detail we're going to add to this. The little nurglings! So I used an oil wash here. This is basically black and burnt umber mixed together. And we just washed it over all the brass areas. It's a little bit more potent than like a normal or an Agrax shade, and I can clean it up afterwards as well. So the oil wash is a bit of a saving grace here because it's a lot more rich when it comes to the actual shade. Now for a cool trick. We're going to take a flying stand and a lighter and then burn it. No, I'm joking. Oh, you don't burn it. What we're going to do is hold the flying stand above a flame, a naked flame. Now, as you can see, it starts to melt. Now, be very, 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 very careful. This is hot plastic you're playing with here. So, children, if you're doing this, get an adult. Now, this is the bit which I found immensely interesting because I felt like a glass blower at this point because the same kind of effect was happening. I basically used some teasers to pull out the strand of plastic. And I thought, okay, out of this little nurgling's tank, he's going to have a little puncture. It's going to be spilling out little ooze everywhere. I thought initially I could take the top part of it and look like an actual flowing thing. Then I realized it didn't look quite right. So instead I just used the long bit and I thought I'd attach that to it going down to the puddle. Now, the only issue I had is it didn't quite meet the ground. So I needed a connecting point or connecting surface to bring it in line with the puddle. So I thought I'd use GW's Art Coat here. And I thought, okay, that'll be thick enough to bring it to the ground. And it wasn't. It just put a varnish over it. So it kind of worked, but it didn't really. I thought, yeah, okay, it's working. And then it started drying and it just wasn't really thick enough. So I turned to AK Interactive again with their water gel. This went on a lot thicker and allowed me to use some kind of texture there, and it made it look like it was kind of pouring out and the liquid was bubbling out of it as well. So yeah, skip the art coat step. I just put it in there just to make sure you're aware of the weird process that I've gone through. Then we used Plague Blare Fresh again and coloured in all our water gel. And it's pretty grimy stuff. And I kind of wanted it to tie in with the other one as well, so I came back in with Tesseract Glow. We did some highlights and a little bit of wet blending going on there as well. So now we have a little nurgling with a pouring out leaking tank. And all the other nurglings were just put in place with a little bit of AK Interactive Muddy Ground. And that's our model done. That's Mortarion, that's the big guy, that's it. Not many complicated steps, but a lot of little simple steps, so it effectively, yeah, that becomes complicated. But here's the big man himself. That's it. That's the big guy. That was a commission I had to do, and I did enjoy it. It was challenging. It was an interesting concept. I've always wanted to paint him. Now that I say I have, I feel like I can tick that one off the bucket list, so that's cool. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Elston. This is my channel, Elston Nation. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe, like, share around, you know, all that jazz, and stay tuned for more videos in the future. Till then, everyone, be good, be safe, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.